Hi, this is Misha, and we've done videos on Polish AKs and other things, and I thought we would just kind of lay out the pistols. There's often not a whole lot to report on service pistols, but Poland has had some very nice ones in the 21st century. Here we have the Polish P35, often called the VIS, or VIS. Then we have a Polish Tokarev, and this is sometimes referred to as the WZ-48, but I mostly see it referred to as the Wz.33. Then we have, I mix these up and put these in the right place. We have the P-64. And finally we have the P-83, often called the Wanad. So, after World War I, Poland established a factory in the town of Radom, which we often just call Radom today. It's been referred to as Fabryki Broni, FB, Luxnik, Factory 11, Circle 11 throughout the years, depending on the government in charge at the time. And after this, they needed firearms for their military, and they wanted to produce them domestically. Poland was in a very precarious position between Germany and Russia, and had been occupied by one power or another for 400 years. So, they wanted at first to produce under license the high power. It was in the final stages of the development at the time, getting ready for French trials, but Radom ran into some trouble. It had already started to produce the BAR rifle, the light machine gun, under license from FN, and they had major trouble. So relations between FN and Radom were not very good in the 1930s. As a result, a design team in Poland took the best features of the Browning 1911, the Browning high power, and threw in a few of their own and came up with this gun here. It was designed in 1934 and was officially tested and adopted in 1935 and started to go into Polish service in 1936, although it wasn't until 1938 that larger numbers started to be received. It's a pretty standard gun, honestly. We have a single stack magazine. It fires 9x19, 9mm Luger. It is single action only, and it uses a Browning locked breech with the tipping or tilting barrel, falling barrel there. Standard sights, synthetic grips. It has the decockers you saw me use. Spring loaded. It's just a decocker, it's not a safety. It also has a grip safety. Like I said, a single action trigger. So it's a pretty conventional gun. What earns it such a good reputation? For one, it has a very nice grip. It's wider at the bottom and then tapers towards the top, allowing your hand to get a high purchase. It's an all steel construction. It has a nice disassembly feature. It has a catch here you can use to hold the slide back to get the pin out. So unlike on a 1911 or high power, you don't have to hold it back yourself. That's nice. The hammer is quite rounded. A lot of these things were done for the Polish cavalry. They were still using horseback cavalry in the 30s. That's why we have a decocker only, we have a rounded hammer, and we have the grip safety. It's a relatively large full-size gun with about a 4-inch barrel. Excuse me, a 5-inch barrel. Just a little under 5. The early ones made by Poland would have a stock slot in the back, another very popular feature in the 30s. The high power would also have this, although very few stocks survive to this day, if any. The Polish military had under 50,000 in their hands by the time of the German and frankly Soviet invasion in September of 1939. So this was just starting to go into service during the invasion. Now the Germans kept this in production at the occupied Radom factory, and they would have produced over 300,000. Estimates range from about 310 up to about 360. The early guns made under German occupation, not surprisingly, were built with a lot of pre-war parts. Then, as the war would keep on and they had to make new parts, they would start machining their own under occupation, and this is when quality goes down. Not for reliability, but the bluing is not as nice, the machining is a little rougher. Obviously, you know, this is essentially forced, almost slave labor, so what did they have? Also, Radom factory workers were smuggling parts out, so this caused Germany to shift control and final assembly over to Steyr, who would make some key parts in Austria. And towards the end of the war, they would make many simplifications. For example, they would first get rid of the stock slot, as on this one here. Then they would get rid of the takedown catch. They would even get rid of the decocker towards the end. And the finish would go from blued to phosphated, which is something that Germany was experimenting with in 1944. And the very late guns would go away from the synthetic grips to wood grips, which look very much like crate. There's a rumor, it's probably not true, but it's a fun rumor, that they made them from old crates containing cheese. And I've held several, and they do. They have that pattern, looks like an old crate. So they were using just, you know, whatever grade wood grips that you probably could get a splinter off of. But these are very late war guns that came out of the Steyr factory. They're actually quite collectible. So, before and during World War II, you're going to have 350 to 400,000 of these produced, most of them under German occupation. After the war, production would not resume under Poland, because as soon as the Germans left, we end up with Russians. And Poland was more or less convinced to go communist because Russia was still around. So in 1948, the Radom factory began producing almost an exact copy of the Russian Tokarev TT-33 pistol. Like the original Russian, this is also a takeoff on a Browning design. We have a single stack magazine again. We are single action only. We still have a Browning style tipping down barrel. But of course, instead of firing 9x19, now we fire the Soviet standard 7.62x25 Tokarev round. The original gun only had a safety as a half cock. Now this one has a hole in the frame. A little safety was added for import. I pulled it off. It's perfectly legal to do that. So yeah, that's when there's a little hole there. One day I put a little rod in and weld it and blew it over. The early guns would have grips that have the FB logo on them, but this was soon changed to the unmarked grips around 1950, probably because of Soviet complaining that they were acting too commercial. This is also a copy of the earlier Tokarev made in World War II because it has the larger slide serrations. In 1946, the Soviet Tokarev would go to smaller serrations. Polish Tokarevs have nicely blued finishes. They're really better made than the Russian guns, and certainly more than the Romanians and Yugoslavians. But they were also made in peacetime. That said, this gun was not as reliable and really not as ergonomic as the P-35, but the switch was political. For one thing, the ammo commonality with the Soviet Union, and for another, the Soviet Union just wanted its client states to be making its guns. So Poland would make the Wz.33 as an exact copy. I've got a holster for it on the table here. I've got a few different Tokarev holsters. Just thought I'd bring it out for table candy. Well, the Wz.33 was fine, but it's a large caliber. It has quite a bit of penetration. It's not a small gun. So, After Soviet Russia, let me pick up the right one here, adopted this gun here, the Makarov PM, firing the 9x18 PM cartridge, which is a simple blowback gun. Double action though, single as well, with a decocker, 8-round mag. Poland would soon follow suit. They would begin work on making their own guns chambered for 9x18, but this time they did not want to just copy Russia. They wanted to do their own thing for their own purposes. Actually, first came a submachine pistol called the PM-63, or the rack. We'll throw up a picture here. It is a open bolt subgun with a 15 and a 25 round magazine capability and a small stock and foregrip, but it was mostly used as a pistol. But it was a very large pistol, but it was firing 9x18. To make it work reliably and safely, the Polish-made 9x18s had hard primers. Again, we have an open bolt gun. And this gun would partially, but not completely, replace the PPS-43 that had been in Polish service for quite some time. For the pistol, Poland took an interesting tact. This P-64 has a lot of the same features as the Makarov, but it is very different at the same time. We still have a double action trigger, single action with decocker. We have a slide hold back, like on the Russian gun. It's a simple blowback. We do not have a slide release, though. The Russian gun does. We are feeding. Drop the slide here, guys. Maybe. There we go. We are feeding from 6-round mags that are quite different. And obviously 6 is smaller than 8. The P-64, as you see, is quite a bit smaller, although not much lighter because it's still made of all machined steel than the Makarov. It has a barrel about 3 1/4 inches long, so it's more of a PPK size. It's still finely blued. It uses a wraparound 2-piece grip instead of a single piece like on the Makarov. Early ones like this had a bobbed hammer. Later they would go to more of a shelf style hammer that stuck out a little better. The trigger system is interesting. The double action is exceedingly heavy, and that's to ignite those hard primers. They wanted these to use the same 9x18 loads that the PM-63 rack would. By the way, this was made by a design team they began work around 1961 and is often called the Kazak in Poland, which is an acronym for the designers' names. It was a big design team. So they would develop this alongside the PM-63, introducing it in 1964, and it would start to go into military service and see field use beginning in 1965. But this is a small gun. So, in addition to its heavy double action trigger, our single is actually quite nice because the spring is now compressed. If you notice too, the trigger does not move back when it goes into single action mode, whereas on the Makarov here, you'll see it does. See? So the trigger systems internally are very different, and that's because when the safety's on with this pistol, decocked, your trigger is totally disconnected from your hammer. Later they would improve this in the 70s with a more drop safe thing, but when you're safe, for the firing pin, drop safe firing pin, but even here there's really no way to activate the hammer with the safety on. I point that out because it shows this gun was kind of primarily made for carry, police use carry. As a full-size military pistol, it left a lot to be desired. We have a heavy double action, It's a small gun, simple blowback, firing 9x18, so it has pretty stout recoil. Also, we only have a 6-round capacity. So these are often carried by higher ranking officers, and they were very popular with police. But a lot of the older Tokarevs would remain in service with NCOs and others that didn't mind having a full size, but more powerful and more pleasant to shoot pistol. Officially, the P-64 replaced the Tokarev, but unofficially, the Tokarev remained in service for a long time. Throughout the 70s, and I've got some holsters here, P-64. Throughout the 70s, they would work on the P-64. Like I said, they would introduce a few updates. Then they would begin work on simply just replacing it. This would come down to prototypes called the P-78A and P-78B. And there's a whole development there that really for this video doesn't need to get into. These turned into, more specifically, the P-78B. This gun here, the P-83 Wanad. This is still firing 9x18, but it's much more like the Makarov. Size-wise, we're about the same. These both have about a 4-inch barrel, so quite a bit longer than the P-64. Like the Makarov, this has a 8-round mag. You notice the mag even looks like a Makarov mag with the big cutout, but they're not interchangeable, just so you know. Still a simple blowback. Single, double action. Notice that double action is now much lighter and smoother than on the 64. We have a much larger hammer, as you see. We have a slide release, as you see. We still have wraparound polymer grips. Lanyard loop has been moved to the bottom right side. The takedown is interesting on this. You just pull this down. It's not spring loaded, then you can just pull your slide off. Whereas on both the P-64 and the original Makarov, you have a spring-loaded trigger guard you need to pull down to let your slide off. So I think the P-83 has a better method, frankly. Now, the P-64 was made of machined steel. There's very few, if any, stamped metal parts. The P-83, on the other hand, is made from mostly stamped parts with very few machined parts. So it's faster and cheaper to produce and saves on steel. It's still nicely blued, but not quite as deep and lustrous as on earlier guns. But the ergonomic benefits, we have a nice wide rib trigger, we have a larger hammer, we have a checkered top strap to help use the sights better, have a comfortable grip. It really is an improvement over the P-64. And since this is a full-sized 8+1 pistol, this was much better suited for military use. So the military were happy. This is what finally did replace in full the older Wz.33 Tokarev. So this would replace this gun completely. These would be all pulled out. The VIS-35 is long gone. These did not stay in service after the communists took over very long. The P-64 would be out of frontline service after the P-83 Wanad came in. That's its nickname. Polish guns like to have project names. This was the Wanad project. For example, the Tantal, the WZ-88, it was the Tantal project. Anyway, this would stay in service with high-ranking officers used to value a compact pistol and did not use it much. Also, police, especially detectives in Poland, would continue to use it, and I'm sure some still do to this day. The P-83 was adopted in 1983 and was in military service by 1985. And they would produce these in large numbers until 1990 and in smaller numbers up till around the 21st century. These are still in service today, although they have been replaced in more recent years, but they're still phasing them out. They're going to 9x19 guns. They're getting away from 9x18 Makarov, which you can understand with Poland being a NATO nation now. But there's still quite a few P-83s in police and even some reserve military use in Poland. I really like this gun. It took a long time for these to come into the USA. You could find most all the other Makarovs in the 90s, early 2000s, but it wasn't until about 2009 that the P-83s began to appear here. That's because they were just getting surplused out then. They're not parts interchangeable with the Makarov, but they have pretty much the exact same feature set. But I think they have a nicer trigger than most Makarovs, and I really like the large hammer, and I really like the takedown system. The only problem is mags for these are harder to find and more expensive than on a Makarov. But yeah, these were the Polish military standard service sidearms of the 20th century. Just thought we would line them all up. All of these have appeared in other previous videos, but in separate ones. So for more info, you can check those out. If you liked the video, please click like. If you have any questions or comments, we welcome them below. We'll reply as quick as we can. If you haven't already subscribed and could do it, we appreciate every single one of you that does. And if you like com-block firearms, we have quite a few other videos, so please check those out. Well, this is Misha, and please tune in again next time for hopefully more unique and interesting videos. We'll catch you then. Thanks.